Hello artists! Today we're working on our herb garden kit. This is going to be a full tutorial video with a step-by-step process on how to complete these coasters. So let's go ahead and get started. So this process does take about an hour to complete, but if you want to break it up into multiple sessions, you can do that as well. So for example, if you want to stain one day, if you want to paint the coasters on multiple days, do the sealant another day, it's really up to you if you want to complete in one session or break it up into multiple sessions. But the total time is around an hour to finish this. The first step of the process is to prepare our surface for the stain. If you notice on your coasters, there is a slight residue around the design. So all that is just that sap coming through during the engraving process. It's just a part of working with a natural wood material. You'll just need a damp paper towel, and you're just going to lightly go through around the image and wipe that residue off. And you may even see it coming off on your paper towel. And you'll just repeat that process with each of the coasters. So when you're done with that, I would just go through and make sure there's no bits of paper towel. Sometimes that happens as you're wiping them. Get the surface nice and clean. Now that you've prepared the surface, we are going to move on to the next step, which is staining the coasters. So there's a few important things that I want to go over before we start the staining process. One, you will need a roll of paper towels. I like to apply my stain using paper towels. I feel like it gives a much more even application, a smoother application, and I just prefer the look of using the paper towels. If you feel more comfortable, you could always use a paintbrush or a sponge or something along those lines. But for today's example, I will be applying with paper towels. If you prefer wearing gloves during this process, you can use gloves as well. This is a water-based stain, so it should wash off fairly easily off your hands. The other thing that you need to know as you are applying the stain, we really want to identify the direction of the wood grain. We are going to apply in the direction of the wood grain and wipe in the direction of the wood grain. This is just going to give this stain a much more even application. It's going to give it overall a better look to the coasters. And lastly, we really want to get inside of the design. So I will show you a dabbing method to get inside those grooves. This is really just going to make our design pop out, be a little darker, and give a little contrast to the design. As I start the staining process, I'm going to start with 2 paper towels and my stain. And the reason I have 2 paper towels, one paper towel is going to be used to apply the stain, the other paper towel is going to wipe off the excess stain. And as I'm going through doing the coasters, I will need multiple paper towels, so I do have an entire roll ready as well. I'm not going to need the whole roll, but I like to have it so I don't have to get up and grab another roll as I'm staining. So I'm going to use my stain directly out of the container. I'm going to bunch up my paper towel. It does not take much. I'm going to get a small amount and then begin to wipe it on my coaster. So I'm working quickly. I'm working on the front of the coaster first. And I'm applying it in the direction that I see the wood grain. I don't want my coaster very dark, so I'm going to apply evenly and then wipe. If you would like a darker tone coaster, then just go ahead and leave it on a little longer before wiping the excess. Just making sure it applied evenly. And the thing about wood is it's obviously a natural material. And with the variation of wood grain, this stain will apply slightly different in some areas than the other, depending on, how the wood grain is on your coaster. So some areas are slightly darker, but overall it's an even look. I'm just gonna apply a little bit more in this lighter area. Then I'm going to apply to my edges. Same thing, looking at the direction of the wood grain. And I'm making sure when I apply my edges, it's not getting on the front because that will leave a darker area. And if you aren't wearing gloves, just keep an eye out for fingerprints. And if you are wearing gloves, sometimes your gloves can create a texture with the stain. So just to keep an eye out, and if you notice that, try to wipe that off before it dries. And making sure my sides are nice and even and it's not leaving any dark spots on the front. And as you move, it does dry fairly quickly. And I'm gonna move to my back area now. Same process. Nice even coat. I'm going the direction of the wood grain. I'm just spreading a small, even amount over the entire back. I'm just checking my edges and my front to make sure it's even. And now I'm noticing that inside of my design, there's some areas that do not have stain, and I see some areas that are darker that do. So I'm going to use a blotting method and just try to get some stain inside of there. But I want to move quickly because I do not want that texture to show up. So now I'm just quickly moving along to wipe that stain. I need to even my edges out a little bit. If it did not get inside the grooves completely, don't worry, we'll go back through with this small paintbrush to get in those grooves. I'm just checking my edges, making sure that there's no areas I missed. Since this is a set, I'm going to try to match the other coasters to this first one. So if your first one got really dark, then you would try to match the other ones so they all look like they go together as a set. You could always vary them if you wanted to as well. It's really up to you because you're the artist. So now I'm going to repeat the process with each of the coasters, trying to match the color to my first coaster design. Then same process, moving on to my third design. So it's really just a constant moving, making sure there's no stain just sitting, getting darker in one area than the other. I'm just constantly blending the stain out, checking all the sides, making sure that, you know, when I'm doing the back, that parts of it don't get on the sides in a funny area. So just moving quickly throughout the whole process, getting that to apply nice and even on the coasters. Now that I have my stain on, I'm going to look through all my coasters, lay them out next to each other, make sure they all look like they're a set, and double check that there's not any areas that I need to apply a little more stain to. So I'm just looking through, checking my corners, checking the back, making sure that there's no spots that I missed as I was applying this stain. This looks just a little bit lighter. Now just remember that these are natural materials, so the stain will apply slightly different on each of the coasters, and even different spots on the coaster may appear slightly lighter than the other. It really just adds character to the coasters, a uniqueness to the coasters, because it is a natural material, so it is gonna apply slightly different on each of those coasters. The next thing I'm going to do is get my small paintbrush, and any areas that did not get inside the grooves, I'm going to go through with the paintbrush and put the stain in there. Again, I want this design to pop, really give a contrast against the coaster and against the acrylic paints once I place those on there. So I do see on my mint one, some areas that need a little more stain in them. I'm going to apply it in there and then just make sure that I have a paper towel handy to wipe any excess off. Really does not take much to get that into the grooves there. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to check all of the coasters, add the stain into the grooves anywhere that it's missed. Just make sure as you're getting in those grooves that you wipe immediately, because you don't want to have that dark stain on the coaster itself. We just want it inside of those grooves. So now that our coasters are drying, we're going to work on mixing our paints for the colors that we would like to paint on each of the herbs. So if you look on the instruction, there is a color mixing guide at the bottom of the instructions. This will give you the way to mix the colors so they look like our examples. But the great thing about this kit is it's completely customizable. So feel free to mix them however you want. If you'd like them to look like the example, then you can follow along with the color mixing. In your kit, you're given a black, a white, and a green. For the way that I did the example, we are using 4 different greens. So again, if you want to follow along, use the 4 different greens. Maybe you want yours to be all one green. It's really up to you however you want to paint these coasters. So as we start this process, you will need a cup of water and a roll of paper towels. This will help you rinse your brush in between mixing the colors. So in your kit, you are given a black, a white, and a green. So the green we are going to use for one of the coasters, so just the solid green. Then we're gonna create a light, a medium, and a dark value. So let's go ahead and start working on our light value first. So if you look on the color mixing guide, it does say for the light color, 10 parts white, a quarter part black, and 5 parts green. So what that means is I'm basically going to scoop that amount of each of those colors for the light. So I'm going to scoop 10 parts of the white, do a quarter scoop of black, and 5 scoops of green. Now, I say this in all of the tutorial videos, but I really want to preface that I measure with my heart. This is art, this is not a science. So it is not going to be exact. Your scoop may be smaller or larger than my scoop. It's really just to give you a guide how to get close to the way that we mixed our colors. And really with art, it's very personal and unique. So if your colors are slightly lighter, slightly darker, that is okay. Everybody's is going to look different, even using this guide. So please don't stress or worry. This is supposed to be a fun experience, and just measure with your heart like the way that I do. So I'm going to use my paintbrush. I'm going to open up the white, and again, I'm just going to do 10 scoops of white into my painting pot. And as long as you scoop about the same size, the proportions will work out just fine. And I'm going to close that lid so it doesn't dry out. Rinse my paintbrush out. So I'm going to add a 1/4 scoop of black. So you may be wondering why I'm adding the black to the lightest color. This is just going to give it a gray undertone to it. I prefer kind of the muted tones, and this is going to give it like more of a muted green instead of a light green. So just about a tiny 1/4 of a scoop. Again, I'm washing my brush out, and I'm going to scoop 5 parts green. I'm making sure that I'm not getting any other colors in these 3 paint pots because we do not want to get those mixed up when we're still needing to mix these other colors. So I'm going to go ahead and mix these all in my paint pot. And it's really important that you mix them evenly. We don't want to have any streaks of colors. We want it to be one nice, solid color. And you can kind of even look in the bottom of the paint pot to make sure it's evenly mixed. And then you can take that color and compare it to the color mixing guide. So paint does dry slightly darker, so just know that whatever color you have in here is going to be a couple shades darker. I'm going to add a little more white into this. It's slightly darker than what I want it to be. So I'm just going to do about another scoop or 2 of white. Mix that up. Once you're satisfied with your first color, then you will move on to the second color following the same process. The medium color, you're going to do 4 parts white, 1/2 part black, and then 10 parts of the green. Now I'm going to mix those all together and compare it to my previous color. Now I'm moving on to my darkest color. This one is 2 parts black and 10 parts green. Now that I've mixed all of my colors, I'm just opening them up, looking at them, making sure I have 4 different values of green, that I like the look of each of them, and making sure there's nothing else that I want to add to them before I move on to the painting process. So the next step would be to decide which coaster you want to paint for each of the colors. Or if you mixed your colors differently, just making a decision on how you're going to paint your coasters. I always think it's nice to kind of pre-plan, so once you get into it and once you start painting, you're not confused on what you're doing, you know exactly what you want to do ahead of time. So a couple tips. One, again, you want to make sure you have some clean water to wash your brush out in between coasters. And the key with the painting for this is to making sure that we're staying on top of the design and not getting the paint inside of the grooves. So as I'm painting, I'll give you some examples and tips on how to stay out of the grooves. So again, I'm staying on top of the coaster, not getting in the grooves. This will really help our design stand out and pop and create that same effect that we see in our example there. For the colors, I've decided to paint my bay leaf, the darkest design. My basil is going to be my medium color. My parsley will be my regular green, and my mint is going to be my lightest color. Again, you do not have to follow that, but if you like how the example looks, those are the colors that I'm going to paint on each of the coasters. I like starting with my bay leaf because it's the largest design and the simplest design. So this is a good one to start with so you can get a feel for how to do the painting techniques, how to stay out of the grooves, and just play around with it a little bit before you get to a couple of the more complicated designs. And this is a beginner's kit, but if you would like to practice doing some line work, playing around with your paints a little bit, you could always just get a regular piece of paper and practice using the paintbrush with the paint. I know it sounds silly, but there's really a key to the amount of pressure that you apply and the angle of your paintbrush. So obviously, the harder you push down, the bristles are going to spread out and more paint is going on the surface. So using a more gentle pressure in the smaller areas, and then if you need to get in a little tiny detailed area, you're using the paintbrush more upright than you are angled. And it really is just practice. The more you practice, the easier it gets when it comes to painting. So with these, I would definitely use one of your smaller brushes to get in those little tiny areas, one of your smaller liner brushes, and then just play around with the amount of pressure that you need to apply that paint. So again, if you want to get a piece of paper and just kind of do some lines or practice around before you start on the coasters, you can. Or if you want to just jump right in, that's fine as well. This does not have to be perfect. This is about having fun, enjoying yourself, and creating a beautiful piece of decor. So do not feel like you need to practice ahead of time. Again, this is a beginner's project, but just a tip if you do want to work on your line work a little bit, that you could do that on a separate sheet of paper first. I'm going to start with my darkest green, and I have my smallest paintbrush. And when I apply the paint to the paintbrush, I'm just applying it to the tip of the paintbrush. If I load the paintbrush all the way up, then again, more paint is going to get on the surface, and I'm really trying to control it. So I'm wiping the paint down because I had put some on there to show you. I'm just applying to the tip of the paintbrush. And again, this is just practice. The more you do it, you get a feel for it. I'm going to the edge of my design without going inside of the grooves. In the areas that I have a little more space, I put a little more pressure to spread my paintbrush out. The areas that are a little smaller, I'm not putting as much pressure. And as I get close, I can kind of do a dabbing method as well. Just get right up to that design without getting in those grooves. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to turn my coaster. It just gives me an advantage getting in some of these areas. So do not feel like you have to have your coaster facing forward the whole time. Going right up to the edge, but being gentle with my pressure so it does not go inside of the groove. And the thing is, if it does go in the groove, you can always go back through with your stain and cover it up. So if you make a mistake, it's okay. If you get a lot of paint inside the groove, you can either grab a Q-tip or a paper towel and just try to wipe it out and then fix it afterwards with the stain. You also need to decide, do you want the wood to show through? Do you want it to be more of a transparent look, or do you want it to be more opaque and having that paint more thick? If you don't want the wood to show through, you may have to do 2 coats, depending on the color. It's really up to you to make a decision on how you want that final to look. Again, you'll see me load my paintbrush and then kind of wipe it off, just so I get a small amount of paint on my paintbrush. The other reason that I turn my coaster is because I want to be able to stabilize my hand. If my hand is up in the air the whole time painting, one, it's going to put a lot of strain on your hand's going to get tired. Two, you don't have as much stability when you're painting, so it's harder to control the areas that you're painting. So either if there's no paint in one area, like I may turn it and place my hand down on the surface. This will give me more stability as I'm painting. And then that way I have more control, my hand's not shaking, I'm able to get in those smaller areas. Now, as you get more of the design on, you may not be able to rest your entire hand, but you could rest just your pinky, or you can rest your pinky on the table surface. So you can just kind of play around with what's comfortable. But stability is really important when you're painting to get those nice clean lines, clean edges, and not worry about your hand shaking. And as you can see, a little bit of paint actually goes a really long way. It does not take much paint to fill in these designs. Now I'm going to let this design dry. I'll work on my other coasters and then I'll come back to this and see if there needs to be any touch-ups, if I need to add a second layer or add any stain back into those groups. So I'm just going to set this aside so it can dry and then work on my basil design, which is going to be my medium color. Again, if you make a mistake, don't worry. Acrylic paint is pretty forgiving. So if you do happen to make a mistake, you can always go back through and touch those up at the end. And I just focus on one area at a time, one leaf at a time, and then just work my way around the coaster. In these little areas and just barely applying pressure. And my brush is vertical, less angled, to really get in those small areas. So now that I'm finished with my basil design, I'm going to move on to my parsley design, and I'm going to use my regular green for that design. The parsley design does have some smaller areas in it, so I'm just barely using the tip of my brush and applying a very small amount of pressure. And because the areas are smaller and shorter, I'm not able to do as long of strokes with my paintbrush, so I'm just kind of doing smaller strokes to get those areas filled in. I'm all finished with my parsley design now, so I'm going to move on to the mint design, and for that one I'm going to use my lightest color. So the mint coaster has some of the smallest designs or the smallest leaves. So I like to save that one for last so I can kind of get some practice in with the bigger ones first before I get to this more intricate detail on the mint one. And I'm just applying barely any pressure on the mint one. And I have very little paint loaded because I don't want that paint to get spread too far out into my grooves. For the look that I'm going for, I'm going to do an extra coat of this because it is so much lighter. The wood is really showing through. So I will apply my paint now, and then once that dries, I'll go back through and do another layer. Really, the way you decide to layer the paint is up to you. Having the wood show through definitely gives a more earthy, natural feel, if you prefer that with the coasters, or you could do additional layers so the paint is not so translucent. It's really up to you what you want to achieve with the look. Now that I'm done with my first coat of acrylic paint, I'm going to go back through and see if there's any touch-up areas or if I want to add a second coat to my design. So now at this point, I've added a second coat of paint to all of my coasters. It's completely up to you if you want to keep that more translucent look or if you want to add additional coat to get this more opaque look. From here, I'm going to do any touch-ups with my stain. So I'm going to use my small paintbrush and I'm going to look and see if any paint got in the grooves of my design. If it did, I can just go through with the paintbrush and add the stain in there to kind of touch everything up to really make that design stand out and clean it up. And see, for this one, I actually don't really see any of the areas that got paint in the grooves. Again, that's kind of my easier design, so I don't see any touch-ups there. With my basil, I do see a few small areas where I'm gonna go in and put the stain inside the groove to try to cover up that paint. I'm just going in with a really light pressure and trying not to get the stain on top of the paint and just focusing on getting it inside those grooves to kind of touch it up a little bit. I'm just being very careful not to get the stain on top of the paint and trying to just stay inside of those grooves. And really, this is not a necessary step. You don't have to do it. It's just if you want to go through and clean it up. But if you feel good and confident with what you created, then you don't even necessarily need to do this step unless you just want to get a little bit more cleaned up details. Some of the grooves are really small, so it may not be possible to get in there with the paintbrush. Now that my coasters have completely dried, I'm going to move on to adding the sealant on top of the coasters. This is a really important step because it's going to protect your coasters. If you're actually using these coasters and you want to set a drink on it, having the sealant will protect it from any type of condensation or anything that spills on it. It's just really important that we get a nice layer of this sealant on top of your coasters. So the sealant does have a bit of an odor to it. If you want to do this in a more open area or outdoors, somewhere that has a little more ventilation, it does have a stronger smell to it. It is a water-based sealant, but it does have an odor to it. So I'm going to dip my paper towel into my sealant and apply the same way that we did with the stain. We want to make sure that we are applying the way that our wood grain is going, and nice even strokes. So I want to move quickly, get my front, my sides, and then we're gonna wait on the back until that front has dried. Again, if you feel more comfortable wearing gloves, you can also do that at this point as well. And then when you do the sides, you do want to make sure that you're not getting any extra coating on the top. And you're getting a nice even layer. And as you can see, the color really starts to richen up and the wood grain is starting to show through. It just adds also a really pretty look to finishing these coasters. All right, so I did my front and my sides, and I'm gonna allow that to dry before I do my back. Right now, I'm going to repeat this process with all of my coasters. So getting a nice even coat on the entire coaster, making sure you're not missing any of the areas so you're able to get it nice and sealed to protect that wood and all that work that you've done. It really brings out the beauty of the wood. The color, the wood grain really gives a nice look adding this sealant. Now that the front of our coasters have dried, I'm going to go ahead and apply the sealant to the back of the coasters as well. Now that the first coat has completely dried, I'm going to go back through, make sure I didn't miss any areas, and then add one additional layer on the top of my coasters just to give it a little extra protection. And because you have already done one layer, adding that extra coat on the top should be really simple to do. And it should not take much at all. So we are almost done. We are gonna let that sealant completely dry, and then we are gonna move on to the last step of the project. Now that our coasters have had a chance to completely dry, we're working on the last step of the project, which is adding our non-slip padding on the back of the coasters. So these are really simple. They already have an adhesive on them, so you're just peeling them off and putting them on the back of the coasters. So it's just one per each corner. This is just going to protect the coasters and the surfaces that they're being placed on. And then you can just repeat that process with each of the additional coasters. You are now finished with your coasters. Thank you so much for creating with me. I hope you had a wonderful time making this kit, you learned some new skills, and you ended up with a beautiful set of coasters. We'd love to see what you created. Please tag us at Thistle and Hope on all the socials, and make sure you also go check out our other DIY kits we have available.